December 9th, 1945. The winter wind howled through the shattered windows of Frankfurt's municipal hospital, carrying with it the acrid smell of a city still smoldering from war. Captain Harold Morrison, a 32-year-old Army surgeon from Pennsylvania, stood over a makeshift operating table where a small figure lay motionless beneath a blood-soaked blanket. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old, her blonde hair matted with dust and crimson, her lips turning the color of ash. She had mere hours to live, perhaps less. The building around them groaned like a dying beast. Entire wings had collapsed during the Allied bombing campaigns, and what remained functioned as a desperate refuge for the wounded and displaced. Morrison had seen countless casualties in his 2 years with the Medical Corps soldiers torn apart at Normandy. Civilians crushed in London during the Blitz, prisoners barely alive when liberated from camps. But something about this particular child gripped his chest like a vice. Perhaps it was her age, or the small wooden doll still clutched in her tiny fist, or simply the accumulation of too much death witnessed by eyes that once dreamed of healing, not war. "Dr. Morrison, her blood pressure is dropping," said Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American nurse from San Francisco who had proven herself indispensable in the chaotic months following Germany's surrender. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the child's pulse, adjusting the crude foreline they had managed to establish. "She's lost too much blood." "She won't make it through the night." Morrison's jaw tightened. The girl identified only as Elsa Hoffman, according to a tattered identity card found. In her coat pocket had been pulled from the rubble of an apartment building that morning. A structural beam had crushed her leg, severing major vessels. They had managed to stop the bleeding and stabilize the fracture, but her body had already surrendered too much of its vital fluid. She needed blood, and she needed it now. "What's her type?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would complicate matters. "Type B negative," Chen replied, her expression grave. "We've checked the entire hospital. A few German medical staff remaining have all donated what they safely can. We have 3 units of B positive, but nothing that's a safe match." The Universal Blood Type Registry, a concept that would later revolutionize emergency medicine, remained in its infancy. In 1945, mismatched transfusions still killed as reliably as bullets. Morrison ran his hand through his dark hair, feeling the weight of command of consequence. Around them, the hospital struggled with its own survival-limited supplies. Overflowing wards, the complex politics of occupying forces treating former enemies. According to a detailed account published in the Journal of Military Medicine in 1951, such scenarios played out across occupied Germany with heartbreaking frequency. The conquered nation's medical infrastructure lay in ruins, its blood banks depleted, its population suffering from malnutrition and disease. Allied medical personnel faced impossible ethical calculations, daily who to save, when resources allowed for saving only some. Morrison looked down at Elsa's face, peaceful in unconsciousness, unaware that history and biology had conspired against her survival. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid movements, the body's desperate attempt to oxygenate itself with too little blood remaining in her veins. Outside voices echoed through the damaged corridors, the polyglot sounds of occupation, American English, British accents, Russian commands, and the defeated German tongue. Time was running out, and Captain Harold Morrison was a man who refused to accept the unacceptable. Morrison had prepared everything with the meticulous care that had made him one of the most respected surgeons in the medical corps. The transfusion setup occupied a corner of the surgical room, 2 beds positioned side by side, rubber tubing coiled and ready, glass bottles sterilized and waiting. Yet no amount of preparation could eliminate the tension thrumming through the room like a plucked wire. "Sit here," Morrison instructed, guiding Samuel to the donor bed. Lieutenant Chen moved with practiced efficiency, swabbing Samuel's inner elbow with iodine, the brown liquid stark against his dark skin. "We'll start with a cross-match test to absolutely confirm compatibility, then proceed with the transfusion. The whole process will take about an hour." Samuel settled onto the bed, his eyes drifting to Assa's motionless form. "Will she know when she wakes up?" The question carried layers Morrison chose not to unpack. "Does it matter?" "No, sir. I suppose it doesn't." Samuel's voice was quiet, just curious about what gets told, what gets left out. That's always been the colored man's question, hasn't it? What parts of our contribution get recorded? What parts get conveniently forgotten? Chen looked up sharply, but Morrison's expression remained neutral. The medical record will show a transfusion from a type B negative donor. That's what matters medically. And politically, sir? Morrison met his gaze. Politically, we're saving a child's life. Everything else is noise. The cross-match test confirmed what the registries had indicated. Samuel's blood was a perfect match. Morrison drew the sample himself, mixing it with Elsa's plasma, watching for the agglutination that would signal incompatibility. The mixture remained smooth and clear. We're compatible, Lieutenant Chen. Prepare for collection. As the needle entered Samuel's vein and his blood began flowing into the collection bottle, Morrison found himself thinking about the journey of those red cells. They had formed in Samuel's bone marrow, carrying oxygen through vessels that had known the Alabama heat, the Atlantic crossing, the French countryside, now German winter. Soon they would flow through German veins, sustaining German tissue, keeping a German heart beating. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. There was a black American soldier, a man whose grandfather had likely been enslaved, who couldn't vote in 7 states despite wearing his country's uniform, giving his blood to save a child from the nation that had preached Aryan supremacy and nearly destroyed civilization in the name of racial purity. "How did you end up in the medical corps, sir?" Samuel asked, breaking the silence. Morrison suspected the question was motivated more by distraction from the needle than genuine curiosity, but he answered anyway. "I wanted to be a surgeon since I was 12, Morrison replied, monitoring the blood flow. "Watched a doctor save my brother's life after a farming accident. It seemed like the closest thing to magic I'd ever seen." He paused. "Went to medical school at Penn, finished my residency in 39, got drafted in 43, spent D-Day operating in a field hospital 6 miles from Omaha Beach. You save a lot of lives that day, sir." "Some, lost too many." Morrison's jaw tightened at the memory. You learn that medicine and war is mostly about choices. Who you can save versus who you can't. Who deserves care versus who gets it. The gap between medical ethics and military reality. The first bottle filled, rich and dark. Chen disconnected it carefully, replaced it with another. They would need at least 3 units, enough to stabilize Elsa without dangerously depleting Samuel. "My grandmother was a healer," Samuel said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Back in Alabama, folks called her a root woman. She knew plants, herbs, things passed down from Africa. White doctors wouldn't treat colored people, so she did what she could. Delivered half the black babies in our county, set bones, treated fevers." He smiled slightly. Never got her name in any medical journal, but she probably saved more lives than most doctors with fancy degrees. Morrison considered this. Medical history, he knew, was written by those with access to publication, predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly from prestigious institutions. How many Samuel's grandmothers had practiced medicine without recognition? How many contributions had been erased by the simple expedient of exclusion from the record? The second bottle filled. Samuel's complexion had taken on a slightly ashen tone, but his vitals remained stable. "You feeling all right, Private?" "Yes, sir." Just thinking, Samuel gestured toward Elsa with his free hand. "She got family? Parents?" Chen answered, her voice soft. "Her mother died in the bombing that brought down their building. Father's whereabouts unknown, possibly dead, possibly a prisoner, possibly fled. She has an aunt in Munich, but we haven't been able to make contact. Now, she's a ward of the occupation authority, so she's alone." Samuel's expression tightened. 6 years old and alone in the world. That's hard, regardless of whose side she was born on. The third bottle began to fill. Morrison watched the level rise with the focused attention that had served him through countless procedures. Each milliliter represented life flowing from one human to another, crossing boundaries that politics had declared absolute. The science was simple: compatible. Blood types meant successful transfusion, full stop. But the symbolism was profound in ways Morrison suspected would only become clear with historical distance. "Almost done," he said. "You're doing well, Private. This blood is going to save her life." Samuel nodded, exhaustion evident now. Donating 3 units, nearly a pint and a half, was taxing, even for a healthy young man. "Good, that's good, sir." When the final bottle was full, Chen withdrew the needle with practiced gentleness, applying pressure to prevent a hematoma. You need to rest. Drink plenty of fluids. Eat something with iron when you can. No heavy lifting or strenuous activity for at least 24 hours. Morrison was already moving to Elsa's side, the first bottle of Samuel's blood in his hands. The girl's breathing had become more labored in the past hour, her lips nearly blue. They were truly in the final window of viability. He worked quickly, establishing the transfusion line, checking and rechecking connections. Blood began flowing into Elsa's veins, propelled by gravity and hope. Now we wait, Morrison said quietly. The blood needs time to circulate, to reach the tissues starved for oxygen. If her body accepts it, when her body accepts it, we should see improvement. Within 30 minutes, the three of them stood in silence, watching the child who had become the unlikely beneficiary of blood that military regulations said she should never receive. 23 minutes after the transfusion began, color started returning to Elsa Hoffman's lips. It was subtle at first, a shift from blue-gray to pale pink, like dawn breaking over a winter landscape. Morrison felt tension draining from his shoulders, tension he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. Lieutenant Chen checked the girl's pulse, her face breaking into a weary smile. 80 beats per minute, blood pressure stabilizing. Doctor, I think she's going to make it. Samuel Washington, still resting on the donor bed with a glass of water, Chen had insisted he drink, exhaled slowly. Thank God. Thank you, Private, Morrison corrected. God didn't roll up his sleeve and spend an hour giving blood. Before Samuel could respond, the surgical room door burst open. Major Thomas Garrett entered with the force of a man accustomed to having obstacles remove themselves from his path. The senior medical officer for the Frankfurt sector carried 53 years of age and 30 years of military service like a badge of authority. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with cold calculation. Captain Morrison. Lieutenant Chen. Private, ... double quotes. He glanced at Samuel's uniform, noting the insignia. Washington, the pause before the last name spoke volumes. Someone want to tell me what's happening here? Morrison straightened, his voice level. Emergency transfusion, sir. Patient had severe blood loss from crush injuries. Type B, negative, extremely rare. Private Washington was the only available compatible donor in the sector. Garrett's jaw tightened. He walked to Elsa's bedside, observed the blood flowing from the bottle into her arm, then turned to examine Samuel. You gave a colored soldier's blood to a white child. A German child. I gave type B negative blood to a patient who would have died without it, Morrison said. The blood doesn't come with a pedigree, Major. Red cells don't carry racial memories or political affiliations. They carry oxygen. Don't lecture me on hematology, Captain. Garrett's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. You know the regulations regarding blood segregation. The Army has explicit policies designed for battlefield conditions where we have the luxury of choice, Morrison interrupted, his own anger rising now. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a child dying in front of me, with one compatible donor available. I made the choice any doctor would make when faced with saving a life versus following a regulation written by men who never had to watch a 6-year-old girl bleed out. This isn't about the girl, Garrett said. This is about you deciding that your judgment supersedes military protocol. Do you have any idea the political shitstorm this could create? We're occupying a country that spent 12 years preaching racial purity. Now we're telling them their children are being saved by the blood of people the Nazis classified as inferior. And don't even get me started on how this plays back home. Back home, Samuel said quietly from his bed, colored boys are still getting lynched for looking at white women wrong. You'll forgive me, Major, if I don't lose sleep over the political sensitivities of Nazis and segregationists? The room went silent. A private didn't speak to majors that way, especially not a black private to a white major. Chen looked horrified. Morrison tensed, ready to intervene. But Garrett's expression shifted into something more complex than anger, a mixture of discomfort and grudging acknowledgement. No, sir. I have 3 older brothers, 2 younger sisters, and a mother back in Alabama who didn't raise her boys to lie about what they see. You want to write me up for insubordination? That's your right. But I won't pretend that regulations built on hate deserve more respect than a child's life. Garrett turned back to Morrison. The girl, what's her prognosis? Excellent, barring complications. The transfusion is working exactly as it should. She needs several weeks of recovery, proper nutrition, antibiotics, to prevent infection at the surgical site. But she'll live, and if word gets out about where that blood came from, Morrison met his superior's gaze steadily. Then word gets out. I'll face whatever consequences come. Court-martial me if you want, Major. Put it in my service record. But I won't apologize for doing what I was trained to do, save lives. For a long moment, Garrett said nothing. He walked to the window overlooking Frankfurt's damaged streets, his hands clasped behind his back. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that aged him visibly. You put me in an impossible position, Captain. If I report this up the chain of command, you're probably finished as a military surgeon. If I don't report it, and it comes out later, my career takes the hit along with yours. So what are you going to do, sir? Chen asked, surprising everyone, including herself. Garrett turned from the window. The medical record will show that Elsa Hoffman received an emergency transfusion from a type B negative donor. Full stop. No names, no identifying details beyond blood type and volume. The usual medical documentation. He pointed at each of them in turn. None of you will discuss this outside this room. Not with other medical staff, not with your units, not in letters home. As far as the Army is concerned, a child was saved through proper medical procedure during occupation duty. Understood? Yes, sir, Morrison said. Lieutenant Chen. Understood, sir. Private Washington. Samuel nodded slowly. I understand, Major, though. I'll note that this is the second time. I've been asked to make a sacrifice for my country and then be quiet about it. I'm not asking you to be quiet about serving your country, Garrett said. I'm asking you to be quiet about a medical procedure that, if publicized, would create problems for everyone in this room and potentially set back the cause of integrated medicine by a decade. Sometimes discretion serves justice better than publicity. It was a rationalization, Morrison knew, and not a particularly good one. But it was also pragmatic. The United States Army of 1945 was not ready for the conversation this transfusion would force. Perhaps America itself wasn't ready. Private Washington needs rest and a meal, Morrison said. He's cleared from duty for 24 hours. I'll provide written orders. Garrett nodded. See that he gets back to his unit safely, and Captain. Good work saving the girl. That part, at least, was exactly what a doctor should do. After the Major left, silence settled over the room like snow. Elsa slept peacefully now, her breathing deep and regular, her color continuing to improve with each passing minute. Life flowed through her veins, life that had started its journey in Samuel Washington's bone marrow. Will she really not know? Samuel asked again. When she grows up? Morrison considered lying, offering comfortable reassurance. But this man had given his blood. He deserved honesty. She knows she had a transfusion. She asks for details. Whoever tells her story will decide what to include and what to omit. History is like that, full of convenient omissions. Samuel stood, slightly unsteady but determined. Then maybe someday, when things are different, someone should tell the whole story. The parts that matter aren't always the parts that get written down, maybe Morrison agreed. Someday, 3 days after the transfusion, Morrison was completing morning rounds when Lieutenant Chen appeared with a visitor, a thin woman in her early 40s. Wearing a threadbare coat and carrying the haunted expression common to survivors of catastrophic war, her German was hesitant when she spoke to Chen, who translated. Dr. Morrison, this is Frau Helena Schneider. She's Elsa's aunt, from Munich. She received word from the Red Cross about her niece and traveled here to see her. Morrison gestured to his office, a cramped room that had once stored medical supplies. Frau Schneider sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap with the rigid posture of someone expecting more bad news. Through Chen's translation, Morrison explained Elsa's condition, the injuries, the successful surgery, the improving prognosis. She will live, Frau Schneider asked, her voice breaking. She will truly live. Yes, she's young, resilient. With proper care and nutrition, she should make a full recovery. Tears streamed down the woman's weathered face. My sister Elsa's mother, we had not spoken in 2 years. I was opposed to the party, to the war. She believed. We were divided. Now she is dead, and Elsa is all I have left of family. Morrison felt the weight of that statement. How many families had the war shattered, not just through death, but through ideology's corrosive power to turn loved ones into strangers? There was a blood transfusion, Chen said carefully, translating Morrison's words. Your niece had lost a great deal of blood. Without it, she would not have survived. Then I owe everything to whoever donated, Frau Schneider said. I have little, but if there is some way. I can thank Morrison, exchanged glances with Chen. This was the moment where truth and discretion collided. The donor was a soldier, he said finally. An American soldier stationed here in Frankfurt. It was his blood that saved her life. Frau Schneider nodded, unsurprised. An American. Of course, we are fortunate that your army has better medical supplies than what was left of ours. She paused. Might I ask this soldier's name? When Elsa is older, I would like to tell her who saved her life. The question hung in the air. Morrison could deflect, could cite regulations, could offer the comfortable fiction that such details weren't recorded. But something in Frau Schneider's face, the desperate need to find meaning in the rubble, to locate grace notes in the cacophony of destruction, stopped him. The soldier's name, Morrison said slowly, is Private Samuel Washington. He's with the 777th Transportation Battalion. Chen's eyes widened, but she translated faithfully. Frau Schneider repeated the name quietly, committing it to memory. Then she asked another question, and Chen hesitated before translating. She asks, she says. The name Washington sounds like it might be from a colored soldier. She wants to know if that's accurate. Morrison felt the room contract around them. This was the test, the moment where theoretical principles met concrete reality. Yes, he said. Private Washington is a Negro soldier. Does that change how you feel about your niece's rescue? Frau Schneider was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion Chen struggled to capture. I spent 12 years watching my country embrace madness. We were told that some people were superior, others inferior, that blood could be pure or tainted. That race determined everything. She looked directly at Morrison. These lies destroyed my nation and killed millions. Now you tell me that a black American soldier, a man the Nazis would have murdered on sight, gave his blood to save my niece, the daughter of a woman who believed their propaganda. And you ask if this changes how I feel? Morrison waited, unsure what would come next. It changes everything, Frau Schneider said. It shows the lie for what it was. Blood is blood. Life is life. This man, this Private Washington, he didn't ask about Elsa's race or her family's beliefs. He simply gave what was needed to save a child. That is humanity. That is what we lost and must learn again. Chen blinked away tears as she translated. Morrison felt something loosening in his chest, a tension he hadn't known he was carrying. Would you like to meet him? Private Washington. Very much. If he would permit it. Morrison sent word to the 777th. 2 hours later, Samuel Washington arrived at the hospital, clearly nervous. Morrison had briefed him on the situation, but nothing quite prepared Samuel for the sight of Frau Schneider waiting in the corridor outside Elsa's room. The German woman stood when she saw him. For a moment they simply regarded each other, to people from nations that had been at war, from races that ideology had deemed incompatible, meeting in the strange peace that followed catastrophe. Then Frau Schneider stepped forward and, to everyone's surprise, embraced Samuel Washington. She spoke in German, words tumbling out rapidly, and Chen translated haltingly, "Thank you. Thank you for my niece's life. Thank you for showing us that there is still goodness, still humanity, still hope." Samuel stood rigid at first, unprepared for the emotion. Then slowly, he returned the embrace. "Ma'am, I just did what anyone would do. She's a child who needed help." "No," Frau Schneider said through Chen, "you did what not everyone would do. You saw past everything that divides us to what unites us. You are a good man, Private Washington." They stood that way for a moment. This improbable tableau of reconciliation, a black American soldier and a German woman joined by the life of a child. Witnessed by a Chinese-American nurse and a white American doctor. Each represented groups that the century's dominant ideologies had sought to separate, rank, and dominate. Yet here they were, connected by the simple biological fact that type B negative blood functioned the same, regardless of whose veins it flowed through. "May I see her?" Samuel asked quietly. "Elsa?" Frau Schneider nodded, leading him into the room where the girl lay propped up on pillows, coloring in a book Chen had found somewhere. Elsa looked up at the visitors with a curious, uncomplicated gaze of childhood too young to understand the symbolism her survival had acquired, old enough to recognize kindness. Elsa, Frau Schneider said in German. This is the soldier who helped the doctor save your life. Elsa studied Samuel with serious blue eyes. Then she held up her coloring book, showing a half-finished picture of a house with a garden. Do you like flowers? She asked in German. Chen translated, and Samuel smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile Morrison had seen from him. I do. My mother grows flowers back home in Alabama. Roses mostly. I like roses, Elsa said, when the translation reached her. She returned to her coloring, the matter settled in the straightforward way of children, who hadn't yet learned to make things complicated. Samuel watched her for a moment, then turned to Morrison. She's going to be okay. Really okay? Winter deepened over Frankfurt, and with it came the complex machinery of occupation and reconstruction. The Allied Control Council established regulations for governing defeated Germany. Tribunals began examining Nazi war crimes, and displaced millions struggled to find their way home or to new lives. Within this vast historical machinery, small human stories continued to unfold, largely unnoticed by those chronicling the major events. Elsa Hoffman's recovery progressed exactly as Morrison had predicted. By mid-January of 1946, she was walking with assistance, her leg healing well despite the severity of the initial injury. Frau Schneider had moved into a single room near the hospital, working in the facility's kitchen to earn her keep and remain close to her niece. The arrangement was irregular, but Major Garrett had quietly approved it, perhaps his own small rebellion against regulations that seemed designed more for bureaucratic convenience than human need. Morrison found himself visiting Elsa more frequently than medical necessity required. There was something about the child's resilience that drew him, her capacity to find joy in small things despite everything she had lost. She had asked about her mother only once, accepting the truth with the pragmatic sorrow of children who had seen too much. Now she focused on her coloring books, on the stories Frau Schneider read to her, on the careful process of healing. Dr. Morrison, Frau Schneider, said one afternoon in late January, her English improving through daily practice with hospital staff, I must tell you something. About my sister Elsa's mother. They sat in the small visiting area, Elsa napping in her room after physical therapy. Morrison had learned to recognize the particular tone people used when preparing to unburden difficult truths. Margarethi was not a bad woman, Frau Schneider continued. She was ... lost. After her husband disappeared at Stalingrad, she became more devoted to the party. It gave her something to believe in when everything else had fallen apart. She volunteered with the Nazi Women's League, organized collections for the war effort. She truly believed in the Thousand-Year Reich. Morrison nodded, having heard similar stories from other Germans struggling to reconcile their former beliefs with present reality. The psychological mechanics of totalitarianism required this kind of all-consuming faith. Doubt became dangerous. Questioning became treasonous. She would have been horrified, Frau Schneider said softly, to know that a black soldier's blood saved her daughter. The propaganda we were fed about racial contamination, about blood purity, she believed it all. And now that belief is what makes Elsa's survival so... Ironic, is that the right word? Ironic works, Morrison said, though I might also say instructive. Yes, instructive. Frau Schneider smiled sadly. I wonder sometimes what Margarethi would have thought if she could have seen that moment, her daughter dying. And only this man she was taught to despise having the blood to save her. Would it have changed her mind? Or would ideology have remained stronger than love? We can't know, Morrison said. But Elsa's alive, and that's what matters. She gets to grow up, to learn, to become whoever she chooses to be. That's the real victory over that ideology. Life continuing, possibilities remaining open. Frau Schneider reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages worn and stained. I have been writing things down, about what happened, about Private Washington, about all of this. For Elsa, when she's older, she should know the whole truth, not some sanitized version. She should know that her life was saved by a man from a group the Nazis considered inferior, and that this man asked for nothing in return, except to know she would be well. Morrison felt uncomfortable with the weight she was placing on the act. Private Washington did what any decent person would do. I'm not sure it needs to be mythologized, but that is exactly why it must be remembered. Frau Schneider interrupted gently. Because to him it was simply decency. nothing extraordinary. Yet in our world in this time, such decency across racial lines is treated as revolutionary. The ordinariness of his compassion is what makes it remarkable. Do you understand? Morrison did, though he wasn't certain he liked the implications. The fact that a black soldier donating blood to save a white child, counted as noteworthy, said terrible things about the society that made it so. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away at the supply depot, Samuel Washington was discovering that his act of donation had created unexpected complications within his own community. Word had spread among the 777th not through official channels, but through the informal network of communication that existed among soldiers. The response had been mixed and intense. "You gave your blood to a German?" Private Marcus Johnson asked, his voice carrying equal parts disbelief and something harder to identify. Johnson was from Mississippi, a man who had fled north at 17 to escape sharecropping and Jim Crow, only to find segregation waiting in uniform. "Brother, they sent dogs after colored folks back home. They lynched Emmett Till's daddy for wearing the uniform you're wearing. You're giving blood to the enemy." "She was a child," Samuel said quietly. They sat in the colored section of the mess hall, a dozen men from the battalion gathered around. A 6-year-old girl who didn't start this war and didn't choose her race or her nation. She was just a kid who would have died without help. "Plenty of colored kids dying back home who could use help," said Corporal Lewis Thompson, older than most of them at 38. "My nephew got his head cracked open by police in Detroit during the '43 riots. Didn't see any white doctors lining up to save him." Samuel had no easy answer to this. The hypocrisy was undeniable. He was expected to serve, to sacrifice, to extend humanity to former enemies, while his own people remained targets of violence back home. The logic collapsed under examination, yet here he was, defending his choice. "I'm not saying the world is fair," Samuel said finally. "I'm not saying America treats us right or that we don't have every reason to be angry. But when I was sitting in that hospital room looking at that little girl, I didn't see politics or hypocrisy. I saw someone dying who I could help save. Maybe that makes me naive, but I can't regret it." Sergeant Cooper, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Brother Washington is right, and you all know it. We don't get to become what we hate. White folks treat us like we're less than human. Fine, that's on their conscience. But we don't survive that by becoming less human ourselves. We survive it by holding on to our humanity harder than they hold on to their hate." "Easy to say, Sergeant," Johnson muttered. "Hard to live." "Nobody said it was easy," Cooper replied. "But it's necessary. Samuel gave blood to save a life. That's not betraying the race, that's showing what we're capable of when the world finally gets out of our way." The conversation continued late into the evening, voices rising and falling in the eternal debate about how the oppressed should navigate a world built to constrain them. Samuel listened more than he spoke, understanding that his choice had become larger than itself, a symbol others would interpret through their own pain and hope. 3 days later, Samuel received an unexpected summons to Major Garrett's office. He arrived with trepidation, uncertain whether official consequences had finally materialized. He found Garrett with Captain Morrison and a third man, a civilian, with a press credential hanging from his lanyard. "Private Washington," Garrett said, his tone formal. "This is Mr. Philip Werner from the Stars and Stripes. He's doing a story on medical innovations during the occupation. Dr. Morrison has been telling him about some of our more interesting cases." Samuel's eyes met Morrison's, asking the question silently. Morrison's slight nod was both apology and warning. "Private Werner said, extending his hand. "I understand you were involved in an unusual medical procedure or transfusion that saved a German child's life. I'd like to include that in my article, talk about the humanitarian work our forces are doing. Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" Samuel hesitated. This was the publicity Major Garrett had wanted to avoid, yet here was a military journalist preparing to document it. "Sir," he said slowly, "I was told this matter was to remain confidential." "Plans change," Garrett said cryptically. "Circumstances have evolved. The Army's position on such matters is being ... reevaluated." He didn't elaborate. But Samuel understood the subtext. Someone higher up the chain of command had decided the story served a purpose. Werner pulled out a notepad. "So, Private Washington, in your own words, why did you agree to donate blood to a German child?" Samuel looked at the 3 men watching him, each with their own agenda, their own interpretation of what his act meant. He thought about Elsa coloring in her hospital bed, about Frau Schneider's tears of gratitude, about his fellow soldiers' complex reactions, about his mother back in Alabama, who had taught him that kindness wasn't conditional on reciprocity. Because she needed help, Samuel said simply, and I could help her. That's all. It's tied. She was a child who would have died otherwise, and I had what she needed to live. The rest, all the politics and complications, that's for other people to worry about. I just saw someone who needed blood, and I had blood to give. It's not more complicated than that. Werner scribbled notes. And did you have any hesitation? Given that she was German, given the war we just fought? Of course I had hesitation, Samuel admitted. But children don't start wars. Adults do. She didn't invade anybody or believe in any of that Nazi nonsense. She was 6 years old. Would I have felt different if it had been Hitler himself needing blood? Sure, but it wasn't. It was a child. There's been some discussion, Werner pressed, about the racial aspect of the situation. You're a Negro soldier. She's a white German girl. Some might say that's particularly significant given Nazi racial ideology and American segregation. Do you have thoughts on that? Samuel met the journalist's eyes steadily. I think it shows that blood is blood. Type B negative works the same, no matter whose veins it starts in. The people who built laws and ideologies saying different were wrong. It's been proven in laboratories and operating rooms over and over. My thoughts on racial significance are pretty simple. The science says we're all human, all connected. Everything else is just people trying to justify treating others badly. Morrison smiled slightly. Werner wrote furiously. Major Garrett's expression remained carefully neutral, but Samuel thought he detected the slightest nod of approval. The article appeared in Stars and Stripes 2 weeks later on the 8th of February, 1946. Buried on page 7, between a story about baseball league preparations and an announcement about theater performances for troops. The headline read, Army medics save German child. Negro soldier's blood proves life-giving. Werner had kept the story factual, emphasizing the medical success while mentioning the racial elements without excessive dramatization. The response was immediate and divided. Letters poured into Stars and Stripes headquarters from soldiers across occupied Europe. Some praised the medical work and humanitarian gesture. Others expressed outrage in language that revealed exactly why blood segregation policies had existed in the first place. Captain Morrison read some of these letters in Major Garrett's office. Each one a window into the complicated soul of an army that had just defeated fascism while maintaining racial hierarchies within its own ranks. It's bad enough we have to fight alongside cholerids. Morrison read from one letter, his voice tight with controlled anger. But now we're supposed to celebrate them contaminating white blood, even German blood? This is what we fought the war for? He tossed the page onto Garrett's desk. That one's from a lieutenant in the 1st Infantry Division. It's an officer. There are others, Garrett said quietly, gesturing to a larger stack. Plenty of others expressing support, talking about being proud of Private Washington, glad the Army is moving toward a more enlightened position. But yes, the hateful ones are hard to read. Morrison picked up another letter, this one handwritten in careful script. My son was killed at Anzio, he read. He bled out because there wasn't enough plasma available. Now, I read that we're giving colored blood to German children while American boys die. Where are our priorities? Signed Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, Gold Star mother. The room fell silent. The pain in that letter was real and raw, even if the logic connecting her son's death to Samuel's donation was fundamentally flawed. Morrison understood grief's need to find targets. To make sense of senseless loss by constructing narratives of betrayal and misplaced priorities. The Army's official position, Garrett said, is that this incident demonstrates our commitment to humanitarian principles and effective medical care regardless of political complications. They're actually considering using it in training materials about battlefield medicine and ethical treatment of civilians in occupied territories. Using Samuel Washington as a propaganda tool, Morrison said flatly. That's what you mean. Using his action as an example, Garrett corrected. There's a difference. The Army is facing pressure to integrate, to justify segregation policies that look increasingly indefensible after a war fought against fascism. Stories like this complicate the narrative people want to maintain about racial difference. Morrison leaned back in his chair, exhausted by the whole situation. All Samuel wanted was to help save a child. Now he's a symbol whether he likes it or not. Symbols matter, Garrett said. They shape how people think about what's possible. You know as well as I do that medicine has been at the forefront of challenging racial pseudoscience. Blood typing proved that race doesn't determine biological compatibility. That's powerful, especially when demonstrated so clearly. The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Chen's arrival. She carried a telegram, her expression troubled. "Dr. Morrison, this just arrived for you. It's from Washington, D.C." Morrison opened the telegram with growing unease. The message was brief and official. "Your presence requested at Senate subcommittee hearing regarding military medical practices and racial integration policies. Transport arranged for March 1st. Testimony expected, signed Senator William Hendricks, Committee on Military Affairs." Hendricks, Morrison said, recognition dawning. "Any relation to Dorothy Hendricks, the Gold Star mother who wrote that letter?" Garrett checked his files. "Son of Senator Hendricks lost his boy at Anzio. He's been using his grief to fight integration efforts in the military. He's arguing that racial mixing undermines unit cohesion and military effectiveness." Morrison felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. He was being called to testify not as a medical expert, but as a participant. It's a political battle that had been brewing since long before Elsa Hoffman's transfusion. "They're going to try to make an example of me. Paint this as an example of army overreach or misguided liberal ideology or whatever other nonsense serves their agenda." "Probably," Garrett admitted. "But you'll also have an opportunity to present the medical facts, to explain what happened and why. That's not nothing, Harold. Senate testimony gets attention. You might actually move the needle on this issue, or I might torpedo my career and accomplish nothing," Morrison countered. "Let's be realistic about how these things usually go." Chen spoke up, surprising both men. "Doctor, before you decide how to handle this, there's something you should know. Frau Schneider wants to testify as well. She read the Stars and Stripes article. Someone translated it for her and she's written to the Senate committee." Offering to provide testimony about what happened, Morrison stared at her. "A German civilian wants to testify before the U.S. Senate about American military medical practices. She wants to tell them what Private Washington's Act meant," Chen said. "She thinks Americans need to hear from someone who lived under Nazi ideology, who understands what it means that a black soldier showed humanity to a German child." The absurdity and profundity of it struck Morrison simultaneously. A German woman whose nation had preached racial supremacy now wanted to defend a black American soldier before a Senate investigating segregation in the military. The symbolism was almost too perfect, which made Morrison suspicious of how it would be received. "They'll never allow it," Morrison said. "The optics alone." "Actually," Garrett interrupted, "they might. Senator Margaret Chase Smith is on that committee. She's been pushing for integration, challenging Hendricks on his more reactionary positions. Having a German witness testify about the positive impact of cross-racial humanitarian work. That's exactly the kind of narrative she'd want to highlight." Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out over Frankfurt's slow reconstruction. Somewhere in this city, Samuel Washington was loading supply trucks, probably unaware that his simple act of compassion had metastasized into a political football being fought over by senators he'd never meet. Somewhere else, Elsa Hoffman was learning to walk properly again, her body sustained by blood that military regulations said she should never have received. "If we do this," Morrison said slowly, "if we go to Washington and testify, we need to be clear about something. This isn't about making heroes or villains. It's about a medical decision that saved a life. The moment we let it become theater, we've lost the thread of what actually matters." "Everything is theater when it reaches the Senate," Garrett said pragmatically. "The question is whether it's theater that serves truth or theater that serves ideology. You can't control how senators will use your testimony, but you can control what truth you tell." Morrison made his decision. "All right, I'll testify. But I want Private Washington there too, if he's willing. Not as some prop to be displayed, but as a participant in telling what actually happened. His voice should be heard, not filtered through white officers interpreting his actions." "That could be arranged," Garrett said. "Though I should warn you, putting a Negro enlisted man on the stand before a Senate committee investigating racial issues, that's going to raise the stakes considerably. Hendricks will try to destroy him." "Let him try," Morrison said, with more confidence than he felt. "Samuel Washington is smart, articulate, and honest. He can defend himself better than I can defend him. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Morrison was coached by Army legal officers on how to testify effectively, warned about political traps, cautioned about saying anything that could embarrass the service. Samuel Washington underwent similar preparation, though the advice given to him carried different weight. Be respectful. Don't show anger. Don't give them any excuse to dismiss you as insubordinate or uppity. They're teaching me to perform, Samuel told Morrison during one of their preparation sessions. Not to testify honestly, but to perform the role of the acceptable Negro, humble, grateful, non-threatening. You know what my mother would say about this? What she'd say? It's the same dance colored folks have always had to do in front of white power. Prove you're worthy of basic decency by being twice as good and half as assertive as any white person. I thought fighting in this war might have changed that. It seems it didn't. Morrison had no counter-argument. The truth of Samuel's observation was undeniable. For what it's worth, I think you should testify honestly, not perform. But I'm not the one who faces consequences if senators decide they don't like your tone. No, you're not, Samuel agreed. Which is why I'll make my own decision about how to handle this. On the 1st of March, 1946, Morrison, Samuel Washington, and Frau Schneider, accompanied by a nervous translator, arrived at the Russell Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. The capital was still celebrating victory, still processing the magnitude of what the war had revealed, still wrestling with questions about what kind of nation America would become in the peace that followed. The committee room was smaller than Morrison had imagined, wood-paneled and formal, with senators seated on an elevated dais, looking down at the witness table. The chairman called the hearing to order, and Senator Hendricks led off the questioning. Captain Morrison, Hendricks began, his voice carrying the practiced gravity of a man who knew how to use his dead son as a shield against criticism. You violated Army regulations regarding blood segregation. Do you dispute this? Morrison took a breath. Senator, I followed medical protocols for emergency transfusion. The regulations you reference were designed for battlefield conditions where, do you dispute that you violated regulations? Hendricks interrupted. Yes or no, Captain. The regulations were ambiguous in this context, Morrison said carefully. My interpretation was that saving a life took precedence over your interpretation, Hendricks cut in again. Not the Army's interpretation, not the regulations as written. Your personal interpretation, which you elevated above military discipline and established policy. Is that correct? Morrison felt the trap closing. Any answer he gave would be twisted to serve Hendricks' narrative. Senator, I'm a doctor. My obligation is to save lives using the best medical science available. Type B negative blood is type B negative blood regardless of... And that's exactly the problem, Hendricks said, warming to his theme. Officers deciding that their personal beliefs matter more than regulations. Regulations exist for reasons, Captain. They maintain order, discipline, and clear standards. When we allow individuals to simply ignore rules they find inconvenient, we undermine the entire military structure. Senator Margaret Chase Smith spoke up from the dais. Mr. Chairman, I think we should hear the complete context of what occurred before drawing conclusions about Captain Morrison's motivations. Perhaps we could allow him to describe the medical situation without interruption? Hendricks glared but nodded. Morrison spent the next 20 minutes explaining the emergency, Elsa's condition, the lack of compatible blood in the German medical system, the decision process. He kept his testimony clinical, focused on medical facts, avoiding the political dimensions. When he finished, Senator Smith asked, Captain Morrison, in your medical judgment, would Elsa Hoffman have survived without this transfusion? No, Senator. She would have died within hours, and Private Washington's blood was the only compatible option available. It's the only option within the time frame necessary to save her life. Yes, thank you, Captain. Smith turned to her colleagues. I believe this clarifies that we're discussing emergency medical care, not some ideological crusade to violate regulations. Hendricks wasn't finished. Captain, let me ask you something else. You're aware that many Americans, including Gold Star families like mine, are troubled by the idea of racial mixing, even medical racial mixing. Did you consider how your actions might affect public morale, military cohesion, or respect for established social norms? Morrison met his gaze. Senator, with respect, I considered how to save a child's life. The social norms that would require me to let her die because of where her donor's blood came from, those aren't norms I can respect. Not as a doctor, not as a human being. The room went silent. Morrison had crossed a line, offering judgment rather than just facts, but he couldn't take it back, and wasn't sure he wanted to. "Thank you, Captain," Hendricks said coldly. "We'll hear now from Private Washington." Samuel took the witness chair, and Morrison saw him transform, shoulders straight, face carefully neutral, every word measured. The performance Samuel had resented preparing for became his armor. "Private Washington," Hendricks began, "you gave your blood to a German child. Did you think about American children who might need that blood? American soldiers?" "Senator, I was told there was a child dying and I had the blood type to save her. I didn't think beyond that immediate need." "And you're aware of the social customs in your home state regarding racial mixing?" Samuel's jaw tightened microscopically. "I'm aware of many things about Alabama, Senator." "Answer the question, Private." "Are you aware of laws preventing racial mixing?" "Yes, sir." "I'm aware of those laws. Yet you had no hesitation about mixing your blood with that of a white child." Morrison saw where this was heading and wanted to intervene, but protocol prevented it. Samuel was on his own. Senator, Samuel said slowly, "I believe there's a difference between blood and veins and ... double quotes." He paused, choosing words carefully. ... other forms of mixing that those laws address. Medical science says compatible blood types can be safely transfused regardless of race. I'm not a scientist, but the doctors told me my blood would save her life. That seemed more important than anything else. More important than law, than custom, than the social order. Samuel's mask slipped for just a moment. "More important than letting a 6-year-old die? Yes, sir. I believe saving a child's life is more important than maintaining customs that say we should let her die, even though that child was German. From the nation we just defeated. She was 6 years old, Senator. She didn't start the war. She didn't believe in Nazi ideology. She was just a child who got hurt. Punishing her for where she was born doesn't seem like justice to me." Hendricks leaned forward. "Private, are you telling this committee that you don't believe in maintaining racial boundaries? That you oppose segregation?" The trap was fully sprung. Morrison saw Samuel recognize it, saw him calculating responses. Any answer would be weaponized either as evidence of insubordination and radicalism or as humiliating capitulation. Samuel took a breath. "Senator, I believe in saving lives when I can. Everything else is above my pay grade." It was brilliant deflection, Morrison realized. Neither agreement nor defiance, just simple limitation of scope. Hendricks scowled but moved on. When it came time for Frau Schneider's testimony, translated carefully into English, she provided the perspective no American could. "I lived under a government that said some races were superior, others inferior, that said blood could be pure or contaminated. I watched this ideology destroy my country, kill millions, leave my family in ruins. Then I watched a black American soldier give his blood to save my niece without hesitation, without conditions, without asking for anything. This act taught me what 12 years of propaganda had tried to make me forget, that we are all human, all connected, all responsible for each other. If you ask me whether Private Washington violated some rule by saving my niece, I say, perhaps he did. But he honored something more important than rules. He honored life itself." By the time testimony concluded, it was early evening. Morrison left the building exhausted, uncertain whether they had moved any hearts or changed any minds. Samuel Washington walked beside him, still in uniform, his bearing proud despite the grueling questioning. "Think it mattered?" Samuel asked quietly. "I don't know," Morrison admitted. "Maybe history gets made in small moments sometimes. This might be one of them, or it might just be another hearing that changes nothing," Samuel said. "Either way, that little girl is alive. That's what I'll remember." They walked in silence toward their temporary quarters, two men who had been thrown together by circumstance and blood type, now bound by testimony that would either be remembered or forgotten as history judged fit. The immediate aftermath of the Senate hearing brought neither vindication nor punishment, just the bureaucratic silence that often follows public controversy when powerful interests remain divided. Morrison returned to Frankfurt, Samuel to his transportation battalion, both uncertain what their testimony might ultimately mean for their careers or for the larger questions of military integration. But history, Morrison was learning, moved in strange patterns. Individual acts echoed in unexpected ways, creating ripples that intersected with other ripples, building toward changes that seemed inevitable only in retrospect. In April of 1946, the Army announced new guidelines for blood collection and transfusion. The language was carefully neutral, focused on medical necessity and battlefield efficiency rather than racial equality, but the practical effect was clear. Segregated blood supplies would be maintained for administrative purposes, but medical officers were granted discretion to use any compatible blood in emergency situations where lives were at stake. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which meant it might actually represent progress. "They're calling it the Frankfurt Protocol," Major Garrett told Morrison, showing him the official memorandum. "Named after this sector, though they don't specify why. I suspect Command wants to claim credit for the policy while avoiding explicit connection to your case." "Sounds about right," Morrison said. "Progress disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. I'll take it." The ripples spread in other directions, too. The Stars and Stripes article had been picked up by civilian newspapers back in the States, not front-page news, but steady secondary coverage that kept the story alive. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most prominent black newspapers, ran a lengthy feature on Samuel Washington under the headline, "Alabama Soldier Shows True Meaning of Christian Charity." The article positioned Samuel as an embodiment of Negro Americans' capacity for grace and humanity, despite facing discrimination, using his act to argue for full integration and civil rights. Samuel himself had complex feelings about becoming a symbol. When Morrison visited the 777th in late April, he found Samuel sitting outside the supply depot, reading the latest batch of letters forwarded from various publications. "Listen to this one," Samuel said, holding up a letter. "Dear Private Washington, your act of charity gives me hope that colored people and white people can learn to live together in Christian brotherhood. My son was killed by a Negro man in a robbery in '43, and I have carried hatred in my heart since then. But reading about you reminded me that individuals are not their race, that goodness and evil exist in all people. Thank you for helping me begin to forgive." Signed, Mrs. Helen Patterson, Philadelphia. Morrison sat down beside him. "That's beautiful." "It is," Samuel agreed. "It's also a lot of weight to carry. This woman's son was murdered, and somehow I'm supposed to represent that not all black people are murderers. That shouldn't need proving, but here we are." "Here we are," Morrison echoed. "For what it's worth, I think you handled the Senate hearing brilliantly. Hendricks was trying to trap you, and you didn't give him anything to work with." Samuel laughed without humor. "I gave him exactly what he wanted, a good colored boy who knows his place, who doesn't make trouble, who says the right things. I hate that I had to perform that role. I hate that honesty would have been punished while careful performance was rewarded. But you were honest where it mattered," Morrison pointed out. "When you said saving a child's life was more important than customs that would let her die, that was honest. Powerful, too. Maybe I still feel like I compromised something." Samuel set down the letters. "How's Elsa doing?" "Walking without assistance now. Her leg will always be slightly weaker, but she'll have a normal life. Frau Schneider's working on getting them both to Munich. She has a small apartment there, wants to give Elsa a stable home." "That's good. I'd like to see her one more time before they leave, if that's possible." Morrison arranged it for the following week. They met at the hospital on a warm May afternoon, spring finally asserting itself over winter's grip. Elsa had grown visibly healthier, proper nutrition and medical care working small miracles. When she saw Samuel, she ran to him with the unself-conscious joy of childhood, hugging his legs. "The soldier who helped me," she said in German, which Frau Schneider translated. "Tonkt Helena says you're going away soon." "My unit is being redeployed," Samuel confirmed, kneeling to her level. "But I wanted to see you one more time, make sure you're feeling better." Elsa showed him her leg, now healed enough that only a scar remained. "It hurt for a long time, but Dr. Morrison fixed it, and you helped too with the blood." Tonkt Helena explained about blood types and transfusions. "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up so I can help people like you helped me." Samuel smiled, genuine and warm. "That's a wonderful goal. The world needs good doctors." Frau Schneider had brought something, a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Private Washington, I wanted to give you this before we leave Frankfurt. It's not much, but it's all I have to offer." Samuel unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a hand-drawn picture, clearly Elsa's work despite its childish execution. It showed a tall figure in an American uniform, standing next to a small girl, with a red line connecting their hearts. Above them, carefully lettered in a child's hand, "Thank you for my life." "Elsa made it herself," Frau Schneider said. "She wanted you to have something to remember her by." Samuel stared at the drawing, and Morrison saw his composure crack slightly. "I'll treasure this," he said quietly. "Thank you, Elsa. You stay strong, study hard, and become that doctor you want to be." They said their goodbyes, Frau Schneider embracing Samuel again, Elsa presenting him with a small flower she'd picked. Morrison walked with Samuel back toward the depot, both men silent with their own thoughts. "You know, it's strange," Samuel said eventually. "Back home in Alabama, I could be killed for being in the same room alone with a white woman. Here in Germany, I'm hugging white civilians and nobody blinks. The war changed geography, but not human nature. We're all still carrying the same prejudices, just enforcing them differently depending on where we are." "It's going to get better," Morrison said. "Slowly, maybe too slowly, but it will get better." "What happened with Elsa? The Senate hearing? The policy changes? They're all pieces of something larger. I hope you're right, Doc. I really do." The 777th shipped out in June, redeployed to occupation duty in Japan. Morrison saw Samuel off, shaking his hand and wishing him well. "Keep that drawing safe," Morrison said. "Someday it might be worth something, not monetarily, but historically. Evidence that humanity existed even in dark times." "I'll keep it," Samuel promised. "And maybe someday I'll show it to my kids. Tell them about the time I helped save a German girl's life and caused a political incident by doing the decent thing." They parted ways then. Two men whose paths had intersected briefly but meaningfully. Morrison returned to his duties, eventually rotating back to the States himself. In early 19, he went back to civilian practice, married, had children, built a quiet life as a small-town doctor in Pennsylvania. But he never forgot Elsa Hoffman or Samuel Washington, or that December night when medical necessity had challenged racial ideology and won a small victory in a much larger war. Over the years, Morrison occasionally saw references to the Frankfurt Protocol in medical literature. It was cited in arguments for blood bank integration, used as a case study in medical ethics courses, referenced in civil rights debates about the scientific bankruptcy of racial segregation. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond the individuals involved into something symbolic. In 1954, when the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Brown v. Board of Education, Morrison thought about Elsa. She would be 14 now, probably in school somewhere in Germany, maybe still planning to become a doctor. Did she remember the American soldier whose blood had saved her? Did she understand the significance her survival had acquired in a nation she'd never seen? He wrote letters occasionally to addresses he'd kept from his time in Frankfurt, trying to maintain contact. Most went unanswered. The chaos of post-war Europe made continuity difficult. But in 1956, a letter finally came back. It was from Elsa herself, now 16 years old, written in careful English she'd been studying in school. "Dear Dr. Morrison," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. Tante Lena helped me locate your address through military records. I wanted to write to tell you that I have not forgotten what you and Private Washington did for me. I am now in gymnasium, what you call high school, and yes, I still plan to study medicine. My teachers say I have aptitude for science. I think perhaps I inherited some determination from the blood that saved me, though Tante Helena says that is not how biology works. I would very much like to correspond with you about medicine, and also to know if you have contact information for Private Washington. I have kept the memory of him all these years but do not know how to reach him. With gratitude and respect, Elsa Hoffman." Morrison read the letter 3 times, touched by its earnest formality and the evidence of a life continuing, growing, pursuing dreams. He wrote back immediately, providing what information he had about Samuel, though he'd lost direct contact when Samuel left the service in 1948. Morrison knew Samuel had returned to Alabama, had heard secondhand that he was working in a veterans organization, but had no current address. What Morrison didn't know, couldn't know, was that Samuel Washington had become involved in the emerging civil rights movement. The man who had given blood to save a German child was now working to secure basic voting rights for Black Americans in the South. He organized voter registration drives, faced down intimidation and violence, carried the quiet courage that had let him sit calmly while senators tried to trap him into incriminating himself. When Samuel received Morrison's letter with Elsa's message enclosed, he was recovering from a beating he'd taken at a segregated lunch counter in Montgomery. Reading her careful English, learning she still remembered him, still carried the drawing she'd made, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Here was this German girl pursuing her dreams of becoming a doctor, while he couldn't eat at half the restaurants in his hometown. The irony was bitter and clarifying. He wrote back to Morrison, "Please tell Elsa that I'm proud of her, that she should pursue medicine with everything she has. Tell her the world needs healers, people who see past the artificial divisions we create. Tell her that saving her life remains one of the best things I've done, and that no amount of Senate hearings or political controversy could make me regret it. And tell her that when she becomes a doctor, she should remember that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even when society tells you that some people matter less than others." Morrison forwarded the message, and thus began a correspondence between Elsa Hoffman and Samuel Washington that would span decades to people connected by blood and history, writing across oceans about their lives, their struggles, their hopes for a better world. 20 years passed. The girl who had been pulled from rubble became Dr. Elsa Hoffman Schmidt, a pediatric surgeon in Hamburg. The soldier who had given blood became Samuel Washington, director of a veterans advocacy organization that fought for civil rights and integration. The doctor who had performed the transfusion became Harold Morrison, chief of surgery at a Pennsylvania hospital, still carrying memories of a December night in Frankfurt. They had lived their separate lives, pursuing their separate paths, but remained connected by invisible threads, letters exchanged, newspaper clippings sent back and forth, the occasional phone call on significant anniversaries. In December of 1965, exactly 20 years after the transfusion, they reunited. It was Elsa's idea, organized with characteristic German efficiency. She secured funding to bring both Morrison and Samuel to Hamburg for a medical conference on emergency transfusion protocols, using the 20th anniversary of her survival as the stated occasion, but really just wanting to bring together the three people whose actions had defined her life's trajectory. Morrison arrived first, now 62 years old, gray-haired, but still sharp-eyed. Elsa met him at the airport, a composed professional woman of 25 in a dark suit, her blonde hair pulled back, her bearing confident. Morrison might not have recognized her, except for her eyes, the same blue eyes that had looked up at him from an operating table 2 decades earlier.
"Dr. Morrison,"
she said in excellent English, embracing him.
"thank you for coming."
"I know the journey was long,"
Elsa, Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at you. You did it. You became a doctor."
"Because you gave me the chance to become anything," she replied. "Come, Samuel arrives tomorrow. Tonight I want to show you my hospital, introduce you to my colleagues. Some of them don't believe the story when I tell it." That evening, walking through Hamburg's modernized medical center, Morrison felt the weight of time and change. This city, like Frankfurt, had been rebuilt from ruins. The hospital where Elsa now worked was state-of-the-art, its equipment far surpassing what had been available in that makeshift operating room in 1945. "We have blood banks now that can type and store hundreds of units," Elsa explained as they toured. "Refrigeration, careful screening for disease, complete records. Nothing like what you had to work with, yet you managed with so much less." "Necessity breeds innovation," Morrison said, "though I'm glad today's doctors have better resources." Samuel Washington arrived the next morning, and the reunion was profound. He was 54 now, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with the marks of struggle and perseverance. He had brought his wife Rose and their teenage daughter Michelle, wanting them to meet the people from this story he'd told so many times. When Elsa saw Samuel, she didn't run and hug his legs as she had at 6 years old. Instead, she walked forward with dignity, extended her hand formally, then abandoned formality and embraced him. "You look well," Samuel said, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. "Dr. Hoffman, it suits you." "You look tired," Elsa replied with a doctor's directness. "I've read about the work you're doing in Alabama.
Us.
The marches, the sit-ins, the voter registration. It's dangerous work, necessary work," Samuel corrected. "Just like what you do is necessary work. We're both in the business of saving lives, you literally, me, by fighting for dignity and rights that should have been granted from the start." The medical conference provided the public occasion, but the private reunion was what mattered. The three of them, Morrison, Samuel, and Elsa, sat together in Elsa's apartment that evening, along with Frau Helena Schneider, now 72 and retired, and Samuel's family. "Tell me honestly," Elsa said, pouring wine for everyone. "In all the years since, do you regret what you did? The complications it caused? The political attention? The controversies?" Morrison shook his head. "Not for a second. Every complication was worth it to save your life." Samuel considered longer before answering. "I regret that it was controversial. I regret that the simple act of giving blood to save a child became politically significant because of race. But the act itself, whenever you're alive, you're a doctor, you're doing good work. How could I regret that?" Frau Schneider spoke up, her English heavily accented but clear. "When they pulled Elsa from that building, I thought my family line ended. My sister dead, my niece dying, everything we had been destroyed by a war my nation started. Then you two men," she gestured to Morrison and Samuel, "you chose life over politics, humanity over regulations. You gave me back my family. Oh, you showed me that even in the worst times, people can choose kindness. I've spent 20 years trying to live worthy of that gift." Michelle Washington, Samuel's daughter, had been quiet until now. At 16, she was part of a generation that had grown up with the civil rights movement as backdrop to their childhood. "Can I ask something?" she said hesitantly. "In school, we're learning about Brown versus Board of Education, about integration battles, about all the changes happening. And my dad's work is part of that. But I don't understand if blood integration proved that race doesn't matter medically. Why is everything else still segregated? Why did it take so long for the science to matter?" It was the question at the heart of everything. The adults looked at each other, each seeking words for a truth that was simultaneously simple and complex. "Because people use science when it suits them and ignore it when it doesn't," Samuel said finally. "Blood typing proved that race is biologically irrelevant to transfusion-compatible blood works regardless of skin color. But people who wanted to maintain segregation just ignored that science or claimed it didn't apply to other areas of life. Science can prove things, but it can't force people to accept those proofs if they're ideologically committed to believing otherwise. What your father is saying," Morrison added, "is that prejudice isn't logical. You can't defeat it purely through facts and evidence. It requires moral and political change, not just scientific enlightenment." What happened with Elsa mattered not because it proved something scientifically that was already proven, but because it made the human cost of segregation visible in a particular way. A child who would have died lived because we ignored racial boundaries. That story resonated with people in a way that abstract medical papers didn't. Elsa set down her wine glass. "I've been thinking about this for 20 years, about what my survival means, what obligation it creates. I didn't choose to become a symbol. I was 6 years old, dying with no agency in what happened. Yet people have used my story to argue for integration, for civil rights, for challenging prejudice. Is that fair? Should my life carry that weight?" "It's not about fairness," Rose Washington said, speaking for the first time. She was a schoolteacher from Montgomery, elegant and thoughtful. "Our children don't choose what world they're born into or what their lives come to mean. But they live in that world, and their existence speaks volumes whether they want it to or not. Michelle didn't choose to be born during the civil rights movement, but her existence as an educated young black woman pursuing her dreams is itself a political statement in a country that wanted to deny her ancestors literacy. You didn't choose to be saved by cross-racial blood transfusion, but your survival challenged Nazi ideology and American segregation both. That's not a burden, it's simply truth." The conversation continued late into the evening, ranging across 2 decades of history, personal and political.
Oh.
They talked about the changes they'd seen, the Army's eventual integration under Truman, the Supreme Court decisions on segregation, the civil rights legislation slowly making its way through Congress. They talked about resistances and backlashes, about how progress seemed to move 2 steps forward and 1 step back. "Sometimes I wonder if we're making real progress or just changing the forms of prejudice," Samuel admitted. "Segregation becomes separate but equal, then equal becomes symbolic rather than real. Then we fight for decades to make the symbols meaningful. It's exhausting." "But it is progress," Elsa insisted. "Slow, frustratingly slow but real. 20 years ago, the idea that a black soldier's blood could save a white child was controversial enough to require Senate hearings. Now its routine blood banks are integrated. Transfusions cross racial lines without comment. That's a victory, even if other battles remain. Morrison raised his glass. 2 victories, large and small. To the lives we save and the battles we fight. To the long arc of history, bending toward justice, even when we can't always see the curve. They drank to that. This unlikely gathering of people brought together by blood and history. It's connected across decades and oceans by the simple fact that when faced with death, they had chosen life. The next day at the medical conference, Elsa presented their story formally. She had prepared a detailed medical case study, complete with historical documentation, photographs from the original hospital, an analysis of how the Frankfurt Protocol had influenced military medical practice. But after the clinical presentation, she added something more personal.